I'm excited to welcome you to today's session, Digital Storytelling 101. This is actually the first session of mStoner's 8-part online course on digital storytelling for higher education. I am thrilled to introduce mStoner's storytelling expert, Voltaire Santos Moran, co-founder, managing director, and senior strategist at mStoner. Voltaire has more than 2 decades of experience in communication strategy, marketing, and fundraising for nonprofits. Recently, he's led storytelling and content strategy initiatives with Colorado State, Washington University in St. Louis, Otis College of Art and Design, and the University of Southern California's School of Social Work. Voltaire, I'll turn this session over to you. Let's get started.
All right, so let's begin with a story. Once upon a time, roughly 30 years ago, around this time of year, in an all-boys high school in the heart of downtown Chicago, my friends and I were sitting around the lunch table. And as most high schoolers around this time of year, spring of junior year, are prone to do, we were talking about the future. And at one point, Tony turned to me and he asked, "So Volt, what do you want to do when you grow up?" And I sat back for a while and I thought about it and I said, "Tony, I think I want to do something where I can write. I think I want to be a writer." And Tony turned to me and said, "Writers are a dime a dozen, and if you become a writer, you will have no career and you'll never make any money." And for a very long moment, the foundations of my world shook. Now, to understand why this was so significant, you need to know 2 things. You need to know about me, and you need to know about Tony. So picture me about 30 years ago. I was the short, fat Asian kid who had absolutely no currency in anything that was important in an all-boys high school. I couldn't dunk, I couldn't hit a baseball, I couldn't score a goal. The one thing I was able to do was I could string a complete sentence together. Now, on the other hand, there was Tony. Tony was everything you wanted to be as a guy. He was tall, he was handsome, he was broad-shouldered, and if we had a prom in an all-boys high school, he would be prom king. And so I thought again for a long moment, and I did what anyone in my place would do when confronted with the immovable force of the high school All-American. I raised my gaze up to his chiseled face, looked him right in the sky blue eyes that he had, and I said, "Oh, crap, I need a new plan." So forward 30 years later, I have been writing every single day of my life. So while my title doesn't say that I'm a writer, I really am one. And while my title doesn't say I'm a storyteller, I believe that I am one as well because I lean on story on a regular basis. I use story every day. And sometimes it's to illustrate a point, sometimes it's to teach, sometimes it's just to entertain and make someone laugh. But I really believe that at the heart of what I do is storytelling. And I believe that it's the same for all of you. I've taken a look at the registration list for this session, and I know that all of you span alumni, development, communications, marketing, and you are the storytellers of your institution. You are the ones who build the reputation, to increase loyalty, engage the community, and inspire the imagination of students and their families. And so my goal in this 45-minute session is to help you to begin to be a better storyteller by understanding the importance of story and making the most of the digital tools and opportunities that are available to you. The agenda I've got for making that happen is 6 points. Number 1, why stories? Number 2, what makes a great story? Number 3, the elements of a digital story and how to produce it. Number 4, I want to give you some ideas for aspiration and inspiration. And then I want to talk a little bit about the horizon that I see. So let's dive in and talk about why stories. Now, the story has been known to man. It's part of basically it's part of our history. Even before there was writing, written language, there were visual stories. And I think that most people are quite familiar with the role of story in terms of entertainment. So when you talk about story, a lot of people think about movies and books that they've loved, but story actually has a much broader and much deeper application for us as human beings. Stories also help us to solve problems. Stories help us to assimilate into culture. Stories help to teach. They provide pattern and order for our lives. They connect us with each other, and they impart traditions. So I want to share a few quotes with you to help you understand how story goes way beyond entertainment into the psychological, the sociological, and even the neurobiological facets of us as human beings. So Jonathan Gottschall has written a really wonderful book called The Storytelling Animal: How Stories Make Us Human. And he says in his book that stories, whether they're delivered through films, books, or video games, they teach us facts about the world. They influence our moral logic. They mark us with fears, hopes, and anxieties that alter our behavior and perhaps even our personalities. If you haven't read this book yet, I would really recommend picking it up. It's one of the best books on storytelling I've read in the last few years. A couple of other perspectives on storytelling. The next one comes from Carmine Gallo, who wrote The Storyteller's Secret. And he showed that a thought triggers the same regions of the brain that would be activated if you were actually experiencing the event in real life. And he talks about this experiment where they being researchers, wired people who were watching a James Bond movie to a machine so they could see what was happening in their minds and in their bodies as the narrative unfolded in this movie. And what they found is that as the narrative arc continued to rise and as James Bond engaged in his hand-to-hand combat with the villain, which usually happens about 4 or 5 times during a James Bond movie, that the same areas in the participants' bodies and minds that would be stimulated if they were doing what James Bond was doing would actually be triggered. So it was like they were living their lives vicariously through the character. A third quote comes from Paul Zak, a neuroscientist. He talks about the fact that compelling stories with emotional triggers alter our brain chemistry. They make us more trusting, understanding, and open to ideas. And Steven Pinker says that stories equip us with a mental file of dilemmas we might one day face, along with workable solutions. So when you take a look at all of those perspectives and you understand the fact that stories have a very deep influence on us beyond entertainment, you realize what the power of story is. And so I'd like to spend a little bit of time talking about the elements of the digital story. And to do that, I want to start off with this quote from Frank Rose, who wrote The Art of Immersion. He talks about the fact that stories are universal. As I said just a little bit earlier, they've been with us from our very beginning as man. But he also comments that the way that we tell stories changes with the technology at hand. Every new medium has given rise to a new form of narrative, and frankly, people want to be immersed. So the best way for me to start talking about the elements of a digital story is to really go to an example of what has really set the standard. And I know that some of you who are in this session are probably thinking, oh God, snowfall again, haven't we heard enough about snowfall? Some of you might not be familiar with this, but this is an example of a story that is 5 years old. It was produced by the New York Times. And most people would point to snowfall as the sort of catalyst, the watershed moment where digital story became a reality. And so I don't want to spend too much time diving into this because you could basically spend hours exploring snowfall. But I want to at least give you a sense of what's happening. The story itself was released, like I said, about 5 years ago, just in time for the holidays. And it had over 2.3 million views. It garnered over 100,000 shares. And it, like I said, was a watershed moment for digital storytelling. So if you take a look at the first page of Snowfall, you'll see that it starts with an animated sort of image of what happens. It talks about this avalanche at Tunnel Creek. You see that the copy is written very specifically for ease of use and digestibility. So unlike a lot of visual design up until this point, this story was put together with the assumption that you are actually going to read the story, not just skim the page, but read the story. And as you scroll down, you'll see embedded media. You'll see that little grace note of having the saturation of that video come to 100% as you scroll. and disappear as you scroll up. You'll see the inclusion of things like animated images here that help to illustrate the geography of what was happening. And you scroll down a little bit more and you'll see embedded photos, you'll see embedded video, you'll see advertisements. You'll also see these profiles. So there were roughly, I would say, half a dozen to 8 storylines of individuals as part of this. And the story of Snowfall dives into each of their personal histories. And then as you move a little bit further down the page, you see slideshows and the inclusion of infographics that help to bring concepts that would otherwise be a little bit difficult to grasp, much easier to visualize. So as I said just a second ago, Snowfall is one of the first really major productions as far as digital storytelling goes. And the reason that I wanted to bring that up is to show you that that is where a lot of people draw their inspiration and where digital story, as I said, had gotten its start. So let me talk about the 5 different elements of digital story. And the first element is visual design. And hopefully what you saw in the Snowfall example is that visual design includes these beautiful interfaces that encourage reading with sufficient clear space that really allow people to focus on the text rather than just on the page itself. There's thoughtful consideration to layout flexibility in regard to viewport size and content load time. So if you take a look at that same story on the mobile, you'll see that the videos, for instance, vanish and they're replaced by static images that are optimized in some cases for Retina display. There are also these touch-optimized content interactions. So it was designed to be viewed on mobile and tablet devices. And as you saw as we were scrolling at first, there were these micro interactions that helped to bring the story to life with small visual grace notes. The second element of digital story is structured content. So when we talk about structured content, we're talking about atomic information units. So little chunks of information that you can use to either promote the story or to parse the story into different presentations. Part of structured content is also metadata and keyword planning to support search engine optimization, tagging and taxonomy, and I've got some examples to show you in just a little bit about some institutions who do that well, and then associated social posts and promotions. I want to talk about that a little bit further into this session as well. The third element of digital story is obviously integrated media. So digital story is really fantastic, or good digital stories are fantastic at pulling in video, photography, audio, illustrations, infographics and data visualization, and data journalism. And for those of you who are not familiar with data journalism, basically it is working with large data sets and allowing people to interact with those data sets in real time. So if you're looking for some examples of how that works, the New York Times does a really brilliant job of this. You take a look back to, for instance, the coverage that they did the night of the election. They were working with a lot of information that people were able to play around with on the screen and interact with. And it makes it a lot easier for people in those interactions to get a grasp of complex ideas. The fourth element is engagement opportunities, and that could include calls to action, commenting and reader contributions, the ability to share and amplify through social media, opportunities to follow the story through mobile push alerts and email updates, and then in some cases, subscription opportunities, podcasts, and playlists. The final element in a really good digital story is technology. And behind technology, we're talking about content management systems, cloud-based collaboration tools, analytics frameworks, and the experimentation capabilities. So the opportunity to do A/B testing and then to optimize content based on audience behavior. So there are 4 principles that I would outline in terms of what makes a great story. Number 1, the story is simple. Number 2, it's engaging. Number 3, it's authentic. And number 4, it's motivating. So let's dive into each of those. And let's begin with a quote by Anne Handley. She wrote a book, I would say a couple of years ago, called Everybody Writes. This is also really high on my book list. It is a very practical sort of next step. So if you've read the conceptual within Jonathan Gottschall's book, The Storytelling Animal, then Anne Handley provides a how-to manual for operationalizing the production of content, whether that be written, digital story, social media, etc. And the first principle we were talking about is this idea that a story should be simple. It should be easy to understand, written in the language of the audience you're trying to reach, and it should be memorable. So let me give you one example of really great storytelling that's simple. So this is the School of North Carolina, the University of North Carolina School of the Arts. And this is the homepage video that gets you started. And it begins with a simple promise. This idea that anyone who attends the School of the Arts will be able to do what they love and to do it immediately. And rather than just saying that, what they do is they splice together different video clips of the disciplines that span the School of the Arts. So everything from filmmaking to makeup, photography, and dance, it's all embedded in this wonderful visual presentation that gives you a sense of what you'll be able to accomplish as a student there. Okay, the next principle is that the story will be engaging. It should be illustrated, it should be unexpected and emotional. And what I would point to as a great example in the New York Times is what's called The Fine Line, the story about Simone Biles and gymnastics. But in the presentation of today's session, you'll have an embedded link. And I would really urge you all to take a look at what they do in this story on the Times, because they do a great job of combining interviews with Simone Biles with explanations of her technique, a long-form narrative, and infographics that illustrate her tumbling passes and why it is that she is arguably the best gymnast in US history. The third element of a really great story is that it's authentic. It's real, it's truthful, and it resonates with your audience. Really great example I point to here is the Arts Center. And this is a panel out of their alumni profiles. If you click into any of these profiles, what you'll find is not only beautiful photography, but very specific stories about each of these alumni, what they learned at the Art Center, and how they applied it to the career of their dreams. And then the final component of what makes a really great story is that it's motivating. It inspires connection, it inspires exploration, and it inspires action. Great example of this comes from the Boston Globe. There's a story called Make It Stop, and this is about gun control. If you take a look at this, what they do is they illustrate the impact of guns on our nation. Everything from how many people get shot in a given second, to the number of deaths, to how many people have gun-related stocks in their retirement plans and how these stocks have done really well. It ends with a panel of the congresspeople who are most involved in gun legislation, and the calls to action on this panel are to tweet to these congresspeople and to email them directly. So this story does a really great job of appealing at the intellectual and the emotional level, what Aristotle used to call the head and heart, and it also allowed people to take those emotions and those thoughts and quickly act on them and make a difference. All right, so let's talk a little bit about how a digital story gets produced. So there are 5 steps, basically, to digital story production. The first step is strategy. The second step is creation. The third step is publication. The fourth is promotion. And the fifth is assessment. Now, I don't think that this will be a surprise to most people, but one of the things that I want to point out is this idea that digital stories take us into a great new world. I started as a print communications person. So I did alumni magazines. I worked on case statements for capital campaigns. And this was all before the web even existed. And so for those of us who had that background, we all breathed a sigh of relief every time something came off the press and got mailed out, because we thought, oh, thank goodness we're done. And we can take a few moments to gather ourselves and we can move on to the next print piece. There's a big difference with digital media. The idea with digital media is that the story begins when you hit publish. This is a great quote from the Huffington Post. The article begins its life at that point. And so if you're doing a digital storytelling story well, you will be able to extend that life far beyond the time that it hits your website. And in fact, in the best of all possible worlds, you will see an integration between or among your digital channels, your social media channels, and your print communications. Now, people ask normally, what are the disciplines that are part of digital storytelling? And here's a brief list. So digital storytelling disciplines include integrated strategy, obviously content development, experience design and visual design, editing and proofing and photography, video production, social media campaigns, front-end and back-end development, analytics, and project management. And you look at that and you're probably saying, Voltaire, that is not a brief list. And you're probably wondering how that maps to actual responsibilities. And so a team for digital storytelling looks like this: strategist, writer, editor, designer, photographer, videography, social media specialist, developer, analytics specialist, and project manager. Now, I need to say immediately that I'm not advocating that you have a one-to-one correlation between the team and a person. So I'm not saying, for instance, that you need a 10-person team to produce really great digital stories. In fact, we've worked with teams that are as small as 2 people, and we've worked with teams that are as large as 25 people. So let me show you a little bit about how that shakes out. So model 1 is what I call the dynamic duo, the writer and the editor working together. And this is where a lot of stories, whether they're print or digital, really start, is 2 people collaborating and figuring out what a great story is and how to tell it. And when you're working with a model like this, the essentials for planning would include an editorial strategy and a measurement plan, a really great story to tell, strong still photography, and a technical platform that makes it easy for you to publish. What you can aspire to in a team of this size is possibly integrating social media and looking at tagging and taxonomy, with the idea that as you tell more stories, you'll be able to find categories to them and starts to cluster and group stories in terms of those categories and start to share them in a personalized way in regards to people's interest. The second model would be a core story team. And that would be everyone from a strategist to writer, designer, and photographer to developer, social media manager, and analytics specialist. And when you have a team this size, you can do everything that that dynamic duo does. You can also do editorial strategy. You can also do social media and technical foundation for experimentation and adaptation. You can start to explore interactive features like what I showed within the snowfall example, and then infographic development. And then the third model is really a mature and extended story team. And the structure of this story team is basically, the idea is that you've been able to build bridges and to establish a rhythm of collaboration across different units. So sometimes these different roles will be in different departments, and you've learned to interact with each other, plan together, and use each other's talents and resources in a way that expands the entire institution's storytelling capacity. And once you get to this stage, in addition to the interactive features and the extended social media campaigns, you can really start to look at photography and video in a much more immersive way. You can customize your content management system for more storytelling, and you can aspire to A/B testing and extended engagement opportunities like podcasts, like subscriptions, and like push notifications. So I want to give you a few examples for aspiration and inspiration, and these are the institutions that I think are doing some of the best work in digital storytelling today. So the first institution would be University of Washington. They have a campaign right now called Be Boundless. It's absolutely beautiful. There are 13 stories currently around this, one for each college or academic unit, and there will be 20 by the time this campaign has finished. If you take a look at each of these stories on the Boundless site, you'll see not only really beautiful presentation, but thoughtful editorial and really engaging people-based storytelling that helps really live out the promise of what it means to be boundless at University of Washington. The second institution that I would point to is Boston University and Bostonia magazine. And many of you have seen these examples before. They're absolutely beautiful. So if you take a look at the online version of Bostonia, what you'll see is that they actually spend a lot of time translating print into meaningful web. So the photography in the print editions is different than the photography that you would see on the website. The site that they have really engages you with illustrations and interactive possibilities. They also have the taxonomy and tagging that I had mentioned a little bit earlier today. So you can go and explore all of the archives of Bostonia magazine and see related stories based on your interest. The third institution that I would point to that's doing a great job is University of Texas and the All Call Day interactive edition. So this is a story, one of their latest stories called Boomtown. They produced the award-winning story called Classroom at the Edge of the World. And they have, I would say, a really great example of a mid-sized team that does some wonderful work in terms of storytelling. And some of you are looking at these examples and you're thinking, yeah, but what happens if you've only got 2 people? What happens if you're only getting started and you don't have a lot of resources and this isn't part of anyone's job description? And so the last example I would point to is Brown 250. So this celebrated the 250th anniversary of Brown University. And this was designed as a campaign site, really oriented toward tablets, tablet first. And I worked with this team, so I know that basically these stories were pulled together largely by a 2-person team. And even within that small of a unit, they did a beautiful job of bringing a number of stories around key themes for the campaign to life. So let's talk a little bit about the horizon. Digital storytelling, I think, has evolved a lot in the last 5 years since the production and the publication of Snowfall. And so I want to point out 3 trends or 3 key things that I think we can look forward to as far as digital storytelling and higher education. So the first is the idea that less is more. And I think that you see this with something like the New York Times. So the New York Times, when they did Snowfall, they wanted to show what was possible. But if you take a look at the interactive stories they produce now, you will see a marked dialing down of the flash and the interactive. And the idea is that people are focusing again on the story and the audience, not so much what the technology can do, but how the technology can work in service to the narrative. And then the final thing I would say is that within this framework of less is more, the idea continues to be show, don't tell. So the number of assets that people are using for digital storytelling become fewer, but they also become more effective at what they do. The second thing I would point out is that more is more. And so as we're seeing digital storytelling mature, we're finding that tools are proliferating, technology and ease of use of these tools is also getting much, much better. So when Snowfall was published, the people who created that actually had to go out of the New York Times' content management system. I think they spent over $150,000 and more than 6 months producing this story. And within a couple of months of that story being published, someone was able to replicate, by far and large, that storytelling format on WordPress for less than $10,000. And that was 5 years ago. So as you take a look at storytelling these days, there are platforms like WordPress and Atavist that really make the technology much more accessible than it was before. so people can spend more time customizing in the technology and spending more time on the actual storytelling. The second thing I would point out of more is more is that there's more of an emphasis now on planning and measurement. At the very beginning of digital storytelling, people were really excited about what they were able to show. And as this has evolved, as this discipline continues to mature, what we find is that people are becoming much more disciplined about the planning that goes behind this and the measurement, not only of the story as a whole, but of the individual elements that comprise the story. So that sort of data-based decision-making becomes more and more important as digital storytelling matures. And then finally, I think within the category of more is more, is I'm seeing that a lot of institutions are finally understanding the importance of and the return of investment on storytelling, and that people are starting to be able to hire more staff, dedicate more budget, and produce or offer more support, and not only in terms of centralized storytelling, but in terms of storytelling at the college or school level, or even at the academic department level. And the last thing I would point out in terms of the horizon is that I think that institutions are quickly learning that the best stories are the ones that we learn together, learn to tell together. And what do I mean about that? So a lot of times I will hear our clients say, but Bolt, we just don't have the resources to do it. When what they're actually saying is, Bolt, we don't have the resources within our department to do this. But the fact of the matter is that maybe the best photographers, the best videographers, some of the best writers, or the knowledge capital experts are not in your department. And it's not a matter of the institution not having the resources or the expertise. It's a matter of bringing those people together and breaking down the silos in which institutions traditionally have operated. The second thing that I think we find is that stories are in service to the institution's brand. And when we learn to tell stories together, what we're able to do is to weave a much broader and deeper narrative than something that is just about our individual area. And that's one of the things I love about the University of Washington's Boundless campaign, is that they spend a lot of time talking about multidisciplinary approaches and bringing together narratives that address multiple parts of the institution. So when you're able to tell stories that are in service to that larger brand identity, that is a great win. And the final thing I would say is that as people are discovering in terms of website development, people are also realizing that storytelling is not a project, but it's a process. So the storytelling doesn't end, like we had said a little earlier, when you hit the publish button. Storytelling doesn't even end when you have completed the social media campaigns and done the after action review on an individual story. The idea is that you publish a great story, as great as you can make it, and then you learn from the analytics and you learn from the testing what worked really well, and then you apply that again and again and again, so that every story that you tell becomes better, it becomes more effective, and it becomes more authentic as a result.